Was it an hour?
And what does the CSS3, how does it relate to the HTML, and what is it? What does it stand for?
Yeah, that's actually going to be part of.
Good.
Yeah, we'll definitely get there, and that's really what I want to get at. Just explaining what it's all about, a little bit of how it works, what it looks like. You know, what the code actually looks like. I'm not going to have you to write it, but just to show it to you, and then we'll actually play around with some of the fancy features and little tools and things that you can do. So you'll be surprised. A lot of the things you see on the web now, they're HTML5 CSS3 that used to have to be done with fancy software, but you can do it with a few lines of code. Is this hype, or is it right for another new technology? I got some laughs, so some of you got to know who this guy is, right? And the reason I thought about him because he and his group, they had this song called "Don't Believe the Hype." And for those that have been working with technology or almost anything, there's always this big buzz and it's the latest and greatest and all this and all that. So a lot of things don't pan out though. A lot of things really don't pan out, but it's almost starting to be like that with HTML5. It's the big buzzword now. Are you using HTML5? You know, I want my site with HTML5, and clients are asking the developer to use a specific technology. You don't do that. You don't tell your provider what tools to use. Just get the job done. So it's a buzzword now. But anyway, it's is it hype or is it right? Ripe in the sense of, is it the right time? Is it the right thing for the right time? All right, so just a little bit of background. I have a timeline here just to sort of set some context and to put things in perspective. This is a diagram that I found. It's what's called an infographic for those that aren't familiar with it. But just a little timeline to set some perspective, like I said. So obviously there had to be a starting point. HTML, or maybe you could consider it HTML1, back in the early 90s, early days of the web, right? HTML comes along. And if you're not sure, it's hypertext markup language. It's, long story short, it was initially designed just to structure content for web pages. That's all HTML was intended for initially. Well, initially it was, but over the course of this timeline, at some point it started to include presentation as well. But, come along. Initially, there weren't any real standards around all of it, but then comes along the W3C, World Wide Web Consortium. If you've seen that group mentioned, w3.org, or you've seen W3 or World Wide Web Consortium, they pretty much came along and made a standard. It wasn't standardized at first. Any and everybody was doing their own thing in terms of how they wrote the code for their web pages. There was no standard. But as time progressed, they started to actually work towards, okay, let's get a formal way of doing this since it's really becoming popular and we know it's going to be big. We need to standardize it, formalize it. So that's what happened along the progression. HTML2 was actually the first officially accepted standard. Then here's the difference where we come in. I mentioned that HTML was primarily intended to just structure the content itself, right? So the question earlier was about, what is the purpose of CSS and how do they work together? So if HTML is really intended to just structure the content, what CSS does, it stands for cascading style sheets. CSS, cascading style sheets, and I can explain that a little bit later if you want more detail. But keyword is style. It's a sheet that determines the style or the presentation of the content. And they're like hand in glove. Where CSS will be the glove, HTML will be the hand. They're always stepping stones. But anyway, bringing us to where we are now. A couple years back, actually it started a little while ago. And if you really dig back into all of these, there's a lot of overlap. And when they were introduced, because again, technology changes so fast, they really couldn't keep up with what people were introducing. And there's so many people involved, so many different groups, so many individuals involved with a lot of these enhancements and developments. But anyway, enough about that. Let's go a little bit further. If you're curious about how that works, what happens is people make recommendations or requests for improvements to the standard. And then the World Wide Web Consortium and other organizations, they basically gather and vote and approve or say, yeah, we're going to implement this, or we're going to change this, we're going to take this out. So there's actually a formalized process that things go through. So long story short, it's not just the HTML though. That's one of the big differences now. And so it's not just a new version of HTML. It's actually more of a concept or a way that things are approached, combining a lot of different tools and technologies to enhance the web experience. So mainly HTML5, CSS3, some JavaScript APIs, and a few other things that are sort of incorporated. It's like a conglomeration of technologies that allow us this new web experience, or enhanced web experience, if you want to say. You always get this, your browser needs to be updated. One of the reasons is because there may be a new tag or a new element that was introduced to HTML or to CSS, and they want to be able to show that. So without getting into the technical details too much. But what it does, it actually adds new elements and attributes, and I'll give you some examples of what that means. For those that have seen it, you know what the element and attributes are. For example, if you wanted to show a video, there's a particular piece of code that you put in to show a video. But what HTML5 has done, it introduced a new element to make it much simpler to do and to give you more flexibility and additional options with the video, instead of just having one option, for example. Trying to keep it, some basic situations there. Adding new functionality. And what I mean by this is not that these things couldn't be done before, but it took a lot more to get them done. It required additional programming, additional services, additional tools, and it wasn't necessarily provided through the HTML. It's actually much closer to the HTML now. There's less overhead. There's less work involved with getting the thing set up. It's much more simplified. When you go to websites, there's a lot more you can do through your browser or on your mobile devices. You don't have to have these extremely powerful computers anymore. The web is becoming a platform where you don't have to have the super fancy processors, the extreme amounts of storage and memory, RAM and all that stuff. You don't, because it's all being run through your browser from the web. So essentially, that's what it's all about. The web is becoming a platform to be able to provide all these tools, the games, the applications, the services, the processing.
They refer to that as cloud computing, or is that different?
In a sense, yes, but not directly. Cloud computing more so deals with actually, you're doing anything that you're going to do through the web, through the internet, that you're not doing directly on your machine. Essentially, it's cloud computing. You have to access the internet in order to access the content and processing all those things, the storage and all that. In a short nutshell definition. But if I give you an example, such as maybe you used to have to, I'm going to give this example later, but we used to have to maybe use Photoshop or something to create a drawing on a page. A few lines of code now in your HTML will do that in the browser. We went from wanting to have the tiniest phone we could have, one of them was called like a clamshell, I think.
Back to the monsters.
And now they're getting bigger. The mobile devices are getting bigger now. So you have your phone, you have your tablet, but the concept was, what about those that are kind of in between? Like, what is it, the Nexus, which is, it's bigger than most phones, but it's smaller than most tablets, and you can actually make calls on it. So what is that? They call them phablets. So all these different sizes, all these different devices. Could you imagine, for those that may have a little bit of programming experience, one of the things you have to consider is, in a lot of cases, what type of device or what type of platform is it going to be run on? And there's a lot of times you have to do things differently for the different platforms that you're going to run it on. Good example, For the Mac users, you have to buy software specifically written for the Mac. If you're using a PC, you have to buy software specifically written for the PC. Even if it's still the same company, Microsoft Office, you have to get the Mac version. Just an example. Could you imagine having to do that for all these different phone providers, not just Android and iOS, and maybe throw RIM in there, BlackBerry, but all the different releases and versions of the Android? I don't even know the names, the blackberries and the cupcakes and blueberries and ice creams but what happens with the web, with thinking about the web as a platform, every device pretty much has a browser. And if you can get it to work in the browser, that cuts out a lot of specific specifications or customizations for all the separate devices. Even though there are multiple browsers, but you get my drift there. So that's HTML5. CSS3, on the other hand, as I mentioned, that deals with the presentation, making the content look pretty. So CSS3 obviously it's gone through its iterations as well, as you saw on the timeline. The most recent standard was CSS2, and what CSS3 has done, HTML5 CSS3, it's not doing away with what was existing, but what it's doing is adding to. So you can still use for the most part, you can use a lot of the previous elements, previous tags, previous styles. But one of the things that happens with these new iterations is that some things do get taken out. And for those that maybe have done a little bit of HTML in the past, something like that marquee that used to plain text scrolling across the page, or that blink, something blinking on and off. Yeah, they actually got rid of that in the newer version. But just some examples of things. What CSS3 has done is it's sort of categorized into modules of the types of styling that can be applied. Some of the animations, so you guys remember the big thing of Flash, how that was like the hype for a while, but it was good, but it had its challenges. Having to have a plugin, or making sure you have the right version of Flash, and maybe your internet connection was slow and it took a long time for the video to download, but it was good for a while. But over time, it just didn't really, fit the bill. So a lot of the animation you see on the web now is actually through HTML5 concepts. A lot of the styling, a lot of the design work. For example, like the animations, you can use CSS to create animations now. A lot of the fancy backgrounds and borders, like you used to have to use image editing software to make a gradient for a background, the colors that fade from one to another, but you can do that through CSS now. You don't have to use a graphics program to make something like that. Special selectors, box model, which is for layouts, transforming items, some text effects, which we're going to look at some examples of that, change the user interface layouts again. But here's the real power. See what CSS3 does, although CSS all along has been for presentation, what it really does now with these new improvements is making the pages even more dynamic and interactive. Again, the animations, of course, something like drop shadows. You don't have to go into Photoshop to do that anymore. You can do that through CSS and benefit smaller file sizes, easier to update and change. You don't have to have special software to do it. A lot of the bevel effects, having multiple background images on a page, or depending on what the user's doing, what type of device they have. Maybe, of course, think about the fact that with mobile phones, the cell phone signal is usually slower than the Wi-Fi. So you want the page to load faster. So if you detect that they're using a mobile device, give them a lower resolution image or a smaller file size for the background or something like that. Those kinds of things. Change the opacity. Another thing is actual embedded fonts. because for those that may not really know how the fonts work, up until now, really, if you had specified a font on your website, that font actually had to be installed on that person's computer. But now you can actually embed the font, include that in your CSS. So things like that can make a big difference. It's starting to become more and more common where it doesn't matter which browser you go through. But just a little bit of statistics here. This is actually maybe a year or so back. These things change so fast. But in terms of the HTML5 compatibility with a lot of the browsers, IE is still kind of low, 26%, whereas the others are in 70s and 80s. But these are pretty much the big five. Google Chrome, Safari, Firefox, Opera, and IE. Those are pretty much the main ones out there. There are others. This was a projection, and I believe this infographic was made in towards middle or end of 2011. So, and it's interesting to see how these things actually pan out. So, this was dealing with developers that were planning to start to use HTML5 when they created their sites and pages and web apps and things. So you can see the huge progression of those that had already started using it within just a year. So it went from planning to use it, would never use it, maybe using it now, a small portion. It doesn't even show up on the results that somebody would never use it. You know, huge progression, huge progression. Looking at the mobile progression, they're projecting by, if you look at the increase here, 2010, 109 million people using browsers on their mobile phones. 2016, they're saying 2.1 billion. And if you really dig into the numbers, it's adding up. And believe it or not, for those that don't know, eventually, soon enough, there are going to be more people accessing the web through mobile phones than through traditional computers. If you think about it, in a lot of other countries, it's easier to get access to a phone than a computer. So it's really just a combination of technologies that are enhancing the web experience. It's not just the new version of HTML, it's actually multiple things working together that have progressed over time. It's the next evolution of web design, web development. Let's check out a few things. Let's see what it actually looks like. Here's an example. For those that have done some HTML, you know it was, and this is what I was mentioning, Randy, where you have to specify and say what type of HTML you're writing your page in. And you used to have to put in something like this with all this extra. And nobody would ever want to memorize this. You would have to go out to the W3 website and copy and paste it, or, you know, if one thing was wrong, it would have issues validating your code and checking and make sure so it wouldn't know which version of HTML you're writing in. But in HTML5, something as simple as this, that's just one example of a simplification. This here, this might be a little too small for you to see, but without getting into the nuts and bolts of HTML, you've got one of the things that started being done, and that was a good segue as well, asking about using tables to lay out a page. The better way became to use what are called divs, which allow you to section off your page and divide up your page. But you had to have all these div tags, and you give them class names and ID names, and some people call it a div soup, because you got div, like alphabet soup all the way through your HTML. Now, granted, you do have meaningful names, but it's still kind of a little bit challenging to kind of grasp what's going on. But HTML5 introduces, I just have a section. That's a section of my page. There's an article, there's a header. Okay, here's another section. Here's my footer. Okay, here's an aside. That's like a side note, you know. Yeah, it's like a side note. Yeah, comment side note kind of thing. Yeah. So even though it only has these names, you can still go into your style sheet and customize them. Yeah. But it makes it a lot easier to look at and read this. Semantics change. It makes more sense. Another example there. It's a little small, but let me pull up a couple of these pages here. Taking a step back, there's a lot of good websites out there if you're curious on how accepted new things are becoming in terms of HTML5 and the CSS3. This is an example here. It's HTML5 readiness. And what this does, it just kind of gives you an idea of the different browsers and what they're actually accepting. There's some sites that really go element by element and say if this element will work in this version of this browser. It really goes into a lot of detail, but this it's kind of like it makes me think about one of those when you go to the paint store, you get the big fan of colors, but it basically once you mouse over and move it around, it tells you which type of element or which type of feature if each browser is capable yet. If you want to actually pull this up on your computers, it's playground.html5rocks.com. Yeah, people still use that. It's rocks. Playground.html5rocks.com. I like this because you don't have to really know, you don't have to go and type in all your code and see from scratch and go to your browser and refresh the page. And this is just a quick way to be able to tinker with the code a little bit and see what it actually looks like. And this is a good way to get a quick idea of some of the things that can be done with HTML5. Playground.html5rocks.com. So the one that's currently selected, there's a shadow done through the code. I didn't have to go into Photoshop and put a drop shadow on there and upload that as an image. Why that is so important, we realize the importance of search, right? No, majority of people, I think it's 80-something% of people type into a search box instead of typing in web address. Even if they know the website address, they still type the web address in the search box. Partially just not really knowing the difference, but two, because it's habit. It's going to come up anyway. Why not just, hey. But search is becoming so critical. There's so much content out there. You want your stuff to come up if somebody's looking for something relevant to what you're providing on the web. So if this was an image, you would have to do some extra work to make it searchable. You would have to put alt tags and descriptions and all those other things around it. But if it's just text, it's much easier for the search engine to search the text, and it cuts out the amount of work you have to do. So all it is, you've got your text in there, and you've got some CSS that modifies it. Box shadow, text shadow. A couple of lines of code, and it does it for you. Right. Some of the other, again, these are some more basic examples, but I wanted to do some of these so you can get the gist of what's happening here. Again, we would have had to do this in some graphics program to create these rounded corners, and they would have to be images. All through CSS now. Just a few examples there. Gradients, like I mentioned, all done through code, and it's even changing when you mouse over. Doing transformations of images. I don't know if you can see that, but it's like a little icon, and it's rotated through the code. It's not 9 different images, it's one image, so you're saving storage space and load time, and through the code you're rotating the image, skewing it, scaling it. So you've got the video in the back of the kid on his laptop. But this is actually a picture-in-picture effect where you can switch between the two, like on a PIP TV. You can do that through HTML5, things like that. Here's another example of something done with HTML5. Bye-bye PowerPoint. Pressing the arrow key and it's moving to the next slide or element. It's bringing in keyboard controls and commands. Yeah, this is, where's this from? This is still from HTML. It's a different portion of HTML5 Rocks. If you go to studio.html5rocks.com, it has a lot of different features and options or demos, samples for you to experiment with. But I think with that said, that's really what I wanted to get into today. Like I said, I didn't want to really do, how to write HTML5. It's just to give you an idea of what it is. And I can send this presentation to Randy and he can post it so you can access the links and things. And